about the teachings and the things that he gets from his parents, and how important it is to listen to the things that his parents teach him, and then apply these things to his life to be a better person. That's kind of the theme that we've talked about so far in Proverbs. And the advice that we're going to talk about today is dealing with adultery and adulteresses, and all the problems that can cause. So before we go any further, I'd like for Keith Davis, if you would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we once again bow before you this morning. Thank you, Father, for this opportunity that we have to gather here together to study from you. We pray, Father, you would be the able to grace spread light unto us. We pray, Father, you would take to heed what we learn and use it to be better servants today. We thank you for your Son Jesus and the life that he spared for us. We still his name we pray.
Okay, so let's look at verse 25. It says, "Lust not after her beauty in thy heart, neither let her take thee with her eyelids." So Solomon here recognizes the role that the heart it has in making moral decisions. And we know that the physical pumping heart doesn't make these decisions. What we're talking about here is our intellect. And if we love God with all of our heart, we can lead a moral life. But if we yield to lust in our heart, then we will continue to sin. So it's a clear choice that we have as human beings. Therefore, Solomon tells his son not to desire the evil woman's beauty in his heart. In Proverbs 31:10, it says, "Beauty is vain." Beauty is skin deep. You need to look past the outer, and you need to look into the inner. And it's worth nothing if it lacks godliness. They can be the most beautiful thing in the world, and if they're a scumbag on the inside, then that's what you ultimately get. In 1 Peter 3:4, he tells a woman, "Let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious." So it's the inner person that is so important. And a truly beautiful woman, therefore, is not only maybe beautiful on the outside, but they are definitely beautiful on the inside. And a man who falls for the beauty of a temptress, or a woman for a handsome man, may discover quickly and too late that the attractiveness is a facade that hides an ugly and painful trap. You see a picture in a magazine of a good-looking guy or a good-looking woman, and say, "Wow, he looks really good," and it turns out that that's a mug shot, because you kind of missed the orange there a little bit. You just looked at the face and you missed the mug shot there. So Solomon also advises his son to avoid becoming captured by the evil woman's eyelashes. When I was reading this and studying this, I kept thinking back about those Donald Duck cartoons, where Daisy Duck, and those big eyelashes, and she's sitting there blinking them things, and and all that kind of stuff, and for some reason, women seem to think that's an attractive feature, and they just blink them things and give you the eye and all that kind of stuff. And it seems like today that's kind of becoming more of a trend, is overdoing the eyelashes and stuff. And it's an outward thing, but it doesn't really do a whole lot for the inner person. So the reference here is to some attractive feature or lure, as is often portrayed a woman who bats her eyes or flutters her eyelashes and things about that line. Sometimes I think that's more to attract attention than it is to attract a man, or just it's kind of about them. I don't know. I don't do my eyelashes, so I wouldn't know about that stuff. And I'll tell you what, it seems to me like it would hurt to get that mascara stuff in your eyes. So like I said, I've got enough problems with my eyes watering without some of that helping me along. So basically that this may attract a man, but if her come hither glances catch him, he may feel like it's an unwary insect capture with like a Venus flytrap. You're just kind of out there trying to trap a good man. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 26. For on account of a harlot, a man is brought to a piece of bread, and the adulteress hunteth for the precious life. So this passage warns against the danger of adultery. And here Solomon begins to explain the dangers which adultery brings into one's life. And this is something that, can ruin your life, ruin your life forever. The Hebrew word here is obscure, and the translators vary in exactly how they render it. And if you take a whole bunch of different translations, this particular verse is translated a lot of different ways. The translations on some of these, like the English Standard Version and the New International Version, imply that the price of a prostitute is relatively small, but adultery with a married woman can cost one everything. And that's kind of the sense that a lot of the more modern translations will give you. And I have no problem with the way that they translate it here, because messing with a married woman can get you shot. Okay, so when you look at the cost of a prostitute versus the cost of getting shot, it is relatively small. But the problem is the adultery, not necessarily who that you do the adultery with. It's really the problem. The New American Standard Version, the King James Version, in contrast, suggests that prostitution can bring a man to poverty, reducing a man to like a loaf of bread. And you get yourself into trouble, and there's court costs and alimony and child support and all that type of thing. And it can take somebody who's doing relatively well, and it could reduce it to pretty much they maybe the cost of a loaf of bread, maybe they can't even afford a loaf of bread in a situation like that.
Well, of course, the analogy, and this, the cost of the physical life can be tremendous. Could be loss of life, just like you said, but the whole real point is loss of the soul. Right. Eternal.
The spiritual life.
Right.
So in either case, the point is clear that there is serious risk involving both, though arguably in most cultures there is more shame and potential revenge involved in adultery with a married woman than with a prostitute. And I don't know about the prostitution problem we've got around here now. It seems like it's not quite as bad as it used to be. I know down on 6th Avenue there's some problems with that, but I had a college professor one time that taught social problems, and I know he did this despite the teacher that was coming in after, because he looked right at her when he did it, and he made this statement. He said a prostitute really has a tough time in Huntington because the co-eds are giving it away free. Okay, you think about that. That happens a lot. And you think about the consequences of something like that happening. And, and the sad thing about it is, a lot of times it comes down to the illegitimate children, that come out of it, and the life that they have to have, and the things the problems that causes. So adultery with a prostitute obviously exacts a cost, because basically, you have to pay for the service, and it can leave a man poor with only enough money, to buy a loaf of bread. That's kind of what we talked about there. However, adultery with a married woman exacts more than money from a man, and it can ruin his reputation and even cost him his life. And nowadays with Facebook and all this social media and all that kind of stuff, one indiscretion like that, it's on Facebook, it's all over the place. Years ago, it may be possible to keep it hid, but nowadays it's not as easy to keep it hid. There's cameras everywhere, and everybody. It gets me on calls and stuff. Is people will stand there and videotape instead of taking care of somebody. They want to get their thing on, and it's kind of the situation where you never know where there's a camera, and you never know where that information is going to end up. Comments about that verse? I'll give you a couple more here. In Proverbs 7:22 and 23, it says, "A man follows a smooth-talking adulteress, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast till the arrow pierces its liver. As a bird rushes into a snare, he does not know that it will cost him his life." So, these adulteresses in these situations, it looks good on paper. They're smooth-talking people, and the results, can be anything from, loss of reputation, loss of money, or to loss of life. So when a man falls prey to an adulteress, or a woman to a seductive man, there's no one else to blame but yourself. You're the one who got yourself into this situation, and we're going to talk about here a little bit later about, of how important it is to avoid it. And the big thing is, don't get yourself in a situation where you have to avoid it. That's one of the important things. One cannot legitimately say that they sin because of a bad marriage, or because they deserve a satisfying sexual experience, or because God put them in the situation. Those are not valid excuses that's going to work. And it's not, situations like that are not going to work in judgment also. James writes in James 1:13 and 14, "Let no one say when he is tempted, 'I am being tempted by God,' for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when is lured and enticed by his own desire." So, when you want to see who the problem is, all you have to do is look in the mirror, and you're going to see who the problem is. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 27. "Can a man take fire in his bosom, and his clothes not be burned?" So this passage of Proverbs warns of the dangers of being associated with adultery. And this statement is echoed by a common proverb of modern English, which says, "If you play with fire, you're going to get burned." It happens, okay? And here's one of the things about it, and of course, doing the fire thing all these years, I thought this verse was needed to have some additional comments. When you go into a burning building, okay, it's hot, okay, and the closer you get to the fire, obviously the hotter it gets. But when we go into fires, we wear this protective equipment. We got a helmet, we got a hood, coat, and all this kind of stuff. And nowadays, it protects you really well. You don't feel the heat like you used to. The problem is, because you can't feel the heat, you don't know how hot it really is. And you come out and your bunker gear is singed, or your helmet is melted around your head. You didn't get anywhere near the fire, but you got near the heat that the fire put off. And it's kind of the situation here. The closer you get to a situation like this, the more possibility you've got of being burned and being burned bad. And the thing about it is, you don't even realize it until it's too late, because you put yourself in that situation to get what you deserve in a situation like that. So the further you stay away from it, the less situations you're going to run into where you're going to get burned by this situation. So in as much the same way, those who dabble in sexual sin do not need to wonder if there will be consequences. It's only when and how drastic the consequences are going to be. The consequences are going to come. And you think, well, I got by with that one. Well, you might have got by with that one the first time. But if there's a second or third time, you might not be so lucky. But even if you get by with it and nobody knows it, who knows it? God knows it, okay? And, he will hold you accountable for the things that has happened. So Solomon compares adultery to fire being carried next to the chest. And in both cases, the adulterer and the person carrying the fire are going to get burned. And like I say, of all the injuries and stuff I think that you can get, being burned in my mind is the absolute worst. You know, I'd rather break a leg than get burned really bad, because it's terrible. And if you've seen people that, you know, that have been burned and the consequences and the way that it affects their life, I mean, this is a very vivid thing in my mind about how dangerous, you know, this situation is. So engaging in immoral sex is like carelessly handling something only to have it harm you. And the truth, or this truth, is demonstrated in the lives of Solomon's parents. You know, he saw this firsthand. After committing adultery with Bathsheba, David experienced the distressing consequences of his sin. You know, it looked good on paper. It sounded like a good thing to do at the time. But look at all the things that happened as the result of that sin. And the problem was, one sin just led to another. You know, trying to get out of the situation. So in Psalms 32, he describes what he experienced as a physical and emotional suffering, guilt and loss of energy. And in his prayer of confession in Psalms 51, David refers to the uncleanness he felt following the act of adultery, the constant pain of being confronted by his sin, the loss of joy, and the feeling of being estranged from God. That's a lot of stuff to be thinking about for just one little act, and it led to all these bad things. So David learned that the momentary pleasure of sin brings long days and nights of physical and spiritual suffering. And that's discussed in 2 Samuel 12, 7 through 15. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 28. One can walk upon hot coals, his feet not be scorched. It's a question there. Fire walking is a trick where someone takes several barefoot steps across a bed of embers. And this has been practiced by many cultures as a ritual, but is also done in the modern world as a stunt, a thrill, or even a team building experience by business. And this is one thing you're not going to see me walking across beds of coal. But there are people out there that do it, and I am told by people who know what they're doing that if you do it right, it's not going to be a problem because of the way that the nerves are in your feet, and you're moving constantly, and you don't hit the rocks long enough to burn. I don't care how big of a team building experience is. This child is not going to try to do the fire walking. I've had the unfortunate thing a couple of times about getting some embers down the back of my bunker coat, and that was bad enough. And I can't imagine going through over a bunch of coals and stuff like that. But you know, it's a stunt or a trick. You know, like a magic trick. So since the coals don't actually conduct heat well, a person can usually take several gentle steps on the coals without any type of massive damage. Okay? Fine with me. However, this trick is just that. It requires controlled conditions. Even then, those who participate in it usually receive minor burns or blisters. And, like I say, if you're going to do this, make sure you're doing it with somebody who really knows what they're doing and you understand, the consequences of doing something like that. So rather than disproving Solomon's rhetorical question, firewalking proves the accuracy of this proverb. And even when the situation is tightly controlled, like I say, it's a risky situation. So sooner or later, everyone who does it gets burned at least a little, and in the context of adultery, Scripture compares illicit sex to playing with fire. And, we talked about this, and we're going to talk about here in verse 27. And there are natural consequences one must expect when they take such risk. And Samson, of course, learned firsthand that the sin of adultery is going to exact a heavy toll. When he honored his Nazirite vow, he triumphed over the Philistines as the Spirit of God came upon him, But when he slept with Delilah, lapped and cut his hair off, he lost his ability to defeat the Philistines. And what ended up happening to Samson? He lost it all. So he thought he could jump up and defeat the Philistines, but he didn't realize that the Lord had left him. And that story there is in Judges, the 16th chapter, if you want to read that. The Philistines overpowered Samson, gouged out his eyes, took him to Gaza in shackles, and made him grind in the prison mill. That's all there in chapter 16. And later they made a spectacle out of him during the feast of their pagan god Dagon. Again, you can read that in chapter 16. So Samson's adulterous affair with Delilah led to his weakness, defeat, blindness, and humiliation. It looked good on paper, but it had terrible effects in the end. And I would say if you would ask him, was it worth it, he would probably tell you that it wasn't. So while the consequences for most adulterers aren't as dramatic as that, sexual sin always leads to some kind of earthly consequence. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 29. So he that goeth into his neighbor's wife, whosoever toucheth her shall not be unpunished. So the scripture affirms that adultery will not go unpunished. It may go unpunished in this life, but it's not going to go unpunished in eternity. And in most cases, it's not going to go unpunished in this life. The earthly consequences might be known only to a few people, and in some cases, it might even be some type of minor problem. But there's always there, and in some way, shape, or form. And more importantly, the sin carries the eternal consequences. That's what Kevin was alluding to. And adultery begins with a look that entices someone to anticipate pleasure, but it leads inevitably to pain and punishment. And this is partly because adultery almost always leads to other sins, mostly to cover up the act of adultery that was committed. So David's sin with Bathsheba led him to conspiracy and even murder by proxy. He really never got over this situation. Obviously it was in favor with God, but I'm sure that this grounded on his mind, for the rest of his life.
Well, the consequences affected his family.
Absolutely.
His sons. Just the whole bit.
Right. And it's like that today. You go out and you do something like that, and you got a family, and it does affect your family. You get into divorces and things along that line, and it affects, it does affect your family. So he confessed with bitter tears and received forgiveness. We can read about that in Psalms 51, 1 and 2. But he paid his penalty for his transgression. The child born of adultery died. We can read about that in 2 Samuel 12, 7 through 15. And turmoil afflicted his household for the rest of his life. And he even experienced a fury of jealousy and a bitter son, Absalom, who led a rebellion and tried to steal the kingdom from him. So, it affected a whole lot more than just him. And Solomon emphatically points out that whosoever commits adultery with his neighbor's wife will be punished. An adulterer may think his sin is a secret, but as David did, God sees all and knows all. And he warns, be sure your sin will find you out. And it's important to guard one's eyes to avoid falling prey to the seduction and experiencing the punishment of sin. It goes back to don't put yourself in the situation that you're going to get yourself in trouble. And Job testifies in Job 31 and 1, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then can I gaze at a virgin? Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 30. Men do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy himself when he is hungry. So, as with any proverb, this is a general case statement of wisdom. We're kind of changing the subject here. And even those who believe in law and order usually have sympathy for those who resort to theft when they're truly desperate. And even today's society often pities a desperately hungry person who shoplifts food items when destitute and starving. And when I was reading this years ago, when I was the fire chief of Green Valley, we had a fireman who lived down the road, and I always remember when we'd have a fire call, he didn't have a vehicle half the time, and he would come running down the road. And by the time he got to the fire station, he was pretty much out of breath. I'm amazed that he never got run over on 16th Street Road. But anyway, I got a call one day from Woody Smith, who was the fire warden. I was the fire warden for Green Valley, and he says, "You better go find Ernie, and you better keep him from hunting in the orchard." I said, "Well, what's the problem?" He says, the game warden's looking for him. I said, "Well, I'll get a hold of him." And I went and found him, and I said, "You better," he says, "Man," he says, "I got to hunt to feed my family." So, that was kind of hard to argue with. And I went back to the game warden. I says, "Look," I said, "this guy, he's hunting to feed his family." And the game warden says, "Well, I'll keep that in mind, and I won't look quite as hard." Here was a guy that basically he worked himself to death. He wasn't the sharpest axe in the shed, but he worked like crazy, to support his family. And I mean, he would do any kind of odd job that he could find. It seemed like every time that he'd get a little bit of a head, something would happen. And I mean, it's hard to argue in a situation like that. And we tried to help him out the best we could. We got him on some commodity foods, and stuff like that. But this is something that happens, every day. We've got a lot of homeless people in around here, and homeless people steal. And some of it they steal for drugs, but some of it times they steal just to get food. But even now, and even as the ancient world, virtually no sympathy is offered to someone who steals his neighbor's spouse. Okay, there's a line there that you don't want to cross. It's okay to steal a little bit of food, but it's really not okay to steal your neighbor's spouse. The thief is still doing wrong, but at least others recognize, his goal was noble there. He was trying to get some food. There ain't nothing noble about stealing your neighbor's wife. Nothing noble at all. So the adulterer violates marriages to satisfy lust, and both the ends and the means are corrupt. So adultery has a habit of inspiring others' sins and such as lies and violence and things along that line. So the adulterer doesn't satisfy his soul, he basically destroys it. And he deliberately violates God's command, "You shall not commit adultery," and that's in Exodus 20 and 14, and therefore he invites God's judgment. And only God's saving grace can erase the sin of adultery and restore the adulterer to favor with God. Adultery is not an unforgivable sin, but you have to straighten the situation out and repent of that. Don't do it again, and then ask God obviously for forgiveness. In 1 Corinthians 6:9-11, Paul reminds his readers that adulterers will not inherit the kingdom of God, but he recalls that some of them had been adulterers before their sins were basically washed away. So, God and Jesus have the ability to clean that situation up, but it's going to start with the person wanting to clean the situation up and doing what it takes to be forgiven of those sins. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 31. "But if he be found, he shall be restored sevenfold. He shall give all the substance of his house." So cultures are often harsh towards thieves as a deterrent. There's some of the Middle East countries that you steal with your left hand, they cut it off. If you're stupid enough to steal with your right hand, they'll cut it off too. And in in this country, we think that's kind of harsh sometimes, but, in other cultures, that's the way things work. It's like the death penalty. I always remember this when old Carl Lucas used to go here, and I don't remember who was teaching the class, but the class got onto the death penalty. And whoever was teaching it, I don't remember who was doing it, asked Carl, said, Carl, what do you think of the death penalty? He said, there's no repeat offenders. So when one stands to lose much more than they could gain, the risk make the theft less attractive. In some places in the country, we've gotten a little bit lax with some of this stuff. You look at the stuff that goes on out in California, if you steal $900 worth of stuff, they're going to take you to jail. But if you steal $899 worth of stuff, they're going to let you go free. That's lunacy. But that's where man kind of gets into the deal and goes against the things that that God teaches. So even when the crime is motivated by supposedly noble goals, stealing bread to starve off hunger, for instance, there is still a penalty that's attached. It's still stealing. Okay, when you break the law, you break the law, and when you do things that's illegal, then there are penalties to it. And if you look at what's going on in this country today, we're not talking about hunger. We're talking about the deal with the illegal immigrants. Okay, I'm sure a lot of those people are really good people, but they broke the law. And when you break the law, there has to be consequences. It doesn't mean we're going to take them out and beat them and all that kind of stuff, but still, there's consequences. And it's like everything else. If there's not a punishment for a crime, then the crime's going to run rampant. If there's not punishment for sin, then sin is going to run rampant. And God hates sin. So in the case of the thief who steals to satisfy his hunger and gets caught, he must perform restitution. There is a penalty that goes along with the thievery. Even though the reason was noble, he's still a thief. He still stole stuff, and he has to make restitution. He will pay sevenfold, Solomon says, which is not an uncommon approach. However, when someone is truly desperate, the right judgment frequently involves a level of mercy. You don't throw them in prison for the rest of their life or something. The punishment has to kind of fit the crime. And a wise judge will look at the situation, consider the consequences and the things and the reasons that he did it, and he'll make a judgment that's in accordance with the law. But there's a level of mercy there. Think where we would be if God didn't have mercy on us. We would be in a bad situation. In John 7:24, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. And that's what we're kind of talking about here. In this context, Solomon is simply pointing out that even crimes of desperation bring consequences. When you break the law, there are consequences. Society typically doesn't hate or prosecute a starving thief, but they also don't tolerate stealing. There has to be balance there. And in contrast, an adulterer has no such excuses. There's no reason that they did that other than their own lust and looking for their own pleasure. And this is not a sin of desperation; it's one of lust. It was a choice that person made to do this. They could just as easily turned and walked away, or even better than that, not got themselves in a situation where they even thought about it. So as much as people might take pity on a destitute shoplifter, they have virtually zero compassion for someone who violates marriage with sexual sin. And depending on the nature of the crime in Solomon's day, the captured thief may have to sell everything he owns to make restitution. And that would be a pretty heavy cost. But if that's the cost for something simple like stealing some food, just think what the cost is going to be for adultery. It's going to be even greater. And even paying with your life. Back, I don't know, I guess they still do in some of the Middle Eastern countries, get caught in adultery and they stone you to death, or they kill you. So adultery is just as damaging as some might argue, or even worse to society than a thief. It's all sin in the sight of God. And the concept emerges in Old Testament law. According to Leviticus 20 and 10, adultery in the nation of Israel was punishable by death. And they would take them out and they would stone them to death. And this was done in public. Okay, and I remember in the movie Chisholm, the old guy was talking about that he witnessed a hanging, and it was ghastly. And of course, John Wayne was agreeing with it. It was ghastly. But here's the thing about it: it was done in public, and people saw what the punishment was, and that stays in your mind what the punishment is and how bad the punishment is. We don't, I think the last public hanging in Wayne County was back around the turn of the 19th century. And as a matter of fact, I think Robbie Thompson even wrote a book about the last hanging in Wayne County. And it was, I guess, out in Wayne, out in public. It got everybody's attention. So, it's kind of the same deal here in these, nations over in the Middle East especially. It's punishable by death. So we read in John 8 about a woman who was caught in the act of adultery, and her accusers, the scribes and the Pharisees, appealed to the law of Moses as commanding that she be put to death, and they were ready to stone her. However, Jesus offered her forgiveness and commanded her to go and sin no more. We can read about that in John 8, 1 through 11. Of course, Jesus had that power of forgiveness, but the thing about it, he forgave her, but what else did he tell her to do? Don't do it again. Don't do it, don't do it anymore. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 32. He that committeth adultery with a woman is void of understanding. He doeth it would destroy his own soul. So the scripture doesn't merely indicate that adultery is a sin or that it risks terrible consequences. The Bible also points out that it's foolish to do something like that. Well, I don't know better than to do that. In the context of Proverbs, foolish means something lacking in good sense, morality, wisdom, and so forth. Not only is it stupid, it's immoral. You should know better. In modern English, we might say it's a stupid thing to do. Now, there's some people that are stupid and there's no cure for it. There's no cure for stupid and you can't take a pill for it. Okay, they just get themselves in that situation. Biblical foolishness, however, does not involve intelligence. Some very smart people are nevertheless extremely foolish, and many are caught in adultery. And in the grip of lust and temptation, those committing adultery often don't consider how destructive that it is, or they know that the risk, but they think pleasure is worth the gamble. And we talked about Solomon's father, David. So we'll quit there. We'll pick up there next week.